In this video, we are going to see examples of use cases. So let's first take a use case and then make some remarks about what they look like, their properties and such things. Okay. So we are talking about a library system, and we know that there is something called members who are actually users of the library. So there are people who in the community who come to the library and become members so they can borrow books. That is very common knowledge. So we have a business process for allowing these members to be registered. So we have a use case for registering a member. So that is the title that I have given. And how does a person become a member? For that, we have the table given here, and it is in 2 columns. And you can see that the title of the first column is actions performed by the actor. The actor in this case is the library staff member who helps a person become a member of the library. And the second column is titled responses from the system. So it is an interaction between this human agent, the library staff, and the system, which is the library system that we want constructed. We are writing the sequence of steps that take us through the business process, that help the library register a member. So we write in the first, as the first step, what the situation is. The customer fills out an application form containing the customer's name, address, and phone number, and gives this to the clerk. So the clerk is the actor. So that is the first step. So this is the starting point for the business process, or in this case, the use case. Then the clerk issues a request to add a new member. We are aware that there has to be a command to add a new member. So the clerk issues that request. Then here comes a response from the system, the first of its kind. You can see that these are all numbered, 1, 2, 3. The system asks for data about the new member. I could have been a little more specific here, saying name, address, and phone number. So that could be an improvement that one could make. The clerk enters the data into the system. So I could have written customer's name, address, and phone number here. That would be a little more helpful for people who read this. But you could see that the customer's name, address, and phone number actually comprise the data. So the data is basically these 3 things. Then the system reads in the data, and if the member can be added, there could be issues why the member cannot be added. Perhaps this member has already been added to the system, for example. Generates an identification number for the member and remembers information about the member. It informs the clerk if the member was added and outputs the member information that was stored. And finally, the clerk gives the user his identification number. So there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 steps. In the first column, we have the actions performed by the library staff member, who is called the actor. And in the second column, we have the responses from the system. So let's make some remarks about use cases in general. Every use case has to be identified by a name. Like here it is registering a member. It should present a reasonably sized activity in the organization. So this is not a bad thing to have as a use case, registering a member. It has a well-defined beginning, a well-defined end, and it does something that is meaningful. Whereas something like asking the member their name, that wouldn't be a use case, all right? It has to have some meaningful sequence of activities that accomplishes something relevant. The first step of the use case specifies a real-world action that triggers the exchange described in the use case. The first step here is the setting for the use case. Why is this use case here? Okay, a person wants to become a member. The use case does not specify how the functionality is to be implemented. You see here, nowhere does it say how this system would read in data. It doesn't really say how it would generate an identification number, or how it would store the information about the member, how it would display the information that was added. None of that. So there is no implementation related stuff. So that is quite easy to write, because you just are writing the requirements. But since we are all programmers, we should be resisting the temptation to write computer related stuff or software related stuff, like classes and objects and all that stuff, right? Let's look at another use case. This is for adding books. This is one of the business processes, right? Again, we have two columns. The library receives a shipment of books from the publisher. So this is the setting for the use case. Why is this use case here? And the clerk issues a request to add a new book. So this is very similar to here, right? Issues a request. Then the system asks for the identifier, title, and author name of the book. The clerk generates the unique identifier, enters the identifier, title, and author name of a book. I want to remark one thing here. The identifier here is created by the clerk, because only the clerk knows what the category this book falls in. For example, in most libraries, we use what are called call numbers. So there are things like, for example, computer science books may be starting with QA 76.6 or some such sequence of digits and letters. Whereas here, the member's ID is generated by the system, as you can see here in step 5, generates an identification number. So that is a difference. Another difference, another thing about books is we assume that there is exactly one copy of each book, or we could treat it in a different way. If there are multiple copies, they are considered different books. Okay, so every copy has its own identifier. That would help a little bit in reducing the complexity of things. It will be less confusing actually that way. So if you have two copies of a Python programming book written by the same person, had title the same, we still consider them different books. Okay. All right. Anyway, coming back to this use case, the clerk enters the information related to the book, and the system attempts to enter the information in the catalog. Well, the catalog is a very common term used in libraries, so there is nothing wrong in using that here, right? Catalog, and informs the clerk about the result. It then asks if the clerk wants to enter information about another book. So you see here we have a shipment of books, so it would be very convenient if the same command could let you add more than one book. So this is what the system is asking. Do you want to enter information about one more book? The clerk either says yes or no, affirmative or negative. If the answer is in the affirmative, the system goes to step 3 and then continues. It asks for the identifier, title, and author name of the book. Otherwise, the use case ends here. Notice that you should not cut corners. You should not write too many things. You should not be combining steps 6, 7, and 5. That is, you should not write here in step 5, if the clerk does not want to add one more book and otherwise go to step 3 kind of stuff. You should show the complete interaction. And you should see that there is a loop here going from step 7 to step 3, and then you flow. So sometimes you will find that you need to massage your use case so that the loop is set up correctly. We will have one more use case in this video, and this is one of the most complicated use cases in the library system. Okay, this is checking out books. Again, we have 2 columns. So what is the setting? The member arrives at the checkout counter with a set of books and supplies the clerk with his or her identification number. So the member does not do the checkout themselves. They have to get that process done by the library staff. The clerk issues a request to check out books. The system asks for the user ID or the member ID. We will keep using member and user interchangeably. Clerk inputs the user ID to the system. If the ID is valid, the system asks for the ID of the book. Otherwise, it prints an appropriate message and exits the use case. If the member ID is invalid, this whole thing quits. That you might think that is a little drastic, but let's say that is what we are wishing for here. The clerk inputs the identifier of the book because that is what was asked, and then the user wants to check out. If the ID is valid, that is the book ID is valid, and the book is issuable to the member, what is issuable? Well, we didn't write here. We don't have, we don't have to put all the details here because it would become too much of a pain sometimes to read it. There not be space. So you could have rules for certain things written in a different table. So you could say that there is a rule for issuability. Actually, all the books are issuable to all members in this case. So there is nothing, this is always true. The book is recorded as having been issued to a member. Member is recorded as having possession of the book, a due date is generated, and details of the transaction are displayed. Now, one thing I wanted to emphasize here, if a book is on hold, then it is not issuable to a member, but then it shouldn't be on the stacks anyway. So it is a moot point actually that way. Now, a lot of stuff is happening here. Member is recorded having the possession of the book. The book is recorded as having been issued to the member. Okay. Why are we doing both? It is because of a requirement that when you look at the books, you should be able to say to whom they have been checked out. Or when you look at a member, you should be able to immediately tell what books that member has checked out. So that is the reason why we are having this done both ways. A due date is generated, and we could have a rule for due date. We could have a table here, that's a table elsewhere actually, that says how all these things are done. You could have a table of rules, and the due date is very simple. It is 1 month from date of issue. So that is a very trivial thing. The details of the transaction are displayed. That is the name of the book, etc. If the book is not issuable, a suitable error message is displayed. The system asks if there are more books. Then you can see that there is a confirmation. You're asking a question to the user. The clerk stamps the due date. Maybe this is a pretty old practice. Prints out the transaction if needed and replies positively or negatively to this question: are there more books? If there are more books for checking out, the system goes back to step 5. So see another loop here. Otherwise, the use case ends. The clerk, here the system is done by step 9, but this use case is not quite over, because the clerk has some more stuff to do. What is that? The clerk has to give all the books to the customer, and the customer leaves the counter.